Yeah.
Working?
Yeah. You look more attractive by hijab.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah. By the way, Dr. Kamilla asked me before if she can wear hijab. I really appreciated your emotional and kind feeling towards Islamic culture. Your respect for our culture means so much to us. But before we start, I want to clarify something about Islam. The idea or image of Islam may be distorted. I know the impact and the important role of social media in the West. Believe me, we don't believe in racial discrimination. As Muslim, we look at all people, whether Christian, whether Muslims, Jew, as human beings. All of us believe in one God. However, I can't convey my feelings in simple words towards you. Your insistence to wear hijab emphasizes the need for dialogue of culture, which is really recommended in such difficult times in such divided world. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for this.
My pleasure.
Hello everyone. It is a great honor for us here at the University of Anbar to have Dr. Kamilla from Lancaster University in this Zoom call. Kamilla Elliott is a professor of literature and media in the Department of English and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. Her principal teaching and research interests lie in the relations between the British literature of the long 19th century and other media, such as painting, illustrations, theater, film, and new media. She is co-chair of the Association of Adaptation Studies and author of Rethinking the Novel Film Debate, which is published in Cambridge University Press in 2003. Portraiture and British Gothic fiction, the rise of picture identification from 1764 to 1835 is also published by Johns Hopkins Press in 2012. And another book on recent book theorizing adaptation, which is published by Oxford Press 2020. She is currently working on a sequel to Portraiture of British Gothic Fiction, continuing the study to 1918 and from Gothic into other modes of fiction. Before we start, if you have any questions you would like to ask Kamilla, Dr. Kamilla will be happy to answer them at the end of her talk. You can either ask her directly or write on chat box. Please try to mute your microphone. Now the word is for you, Kamilla, to start.
Thank you very much for that wonderful welcome. And it's wonderful to hear more about Islam, which I do understand. I have friends who feel the same way and have the same charity and consideration for others as you do. And I'm happy to be wearing this. It feels lovely. So now let's start thinking about Wuthering Heights. The topic today is about how it became a classic. So it is about reception. And here is the outline for the talk today. See if there we go. We're going to look first at the reception of Wuthering Heights when it was first published and how it was absolutely not a classic and how many people criticized it. But we're then going to look at how from the 1850s, people started to change and how over time, different ideas about what literature is and about what Wuthering Heights is intersected with different cultural beliefs and changes in thinking about society to turn Wuthering Heights into a classic. And using my research, which is on film adaptations, we're going to look at the role of film in changing ideas about Wuthering Heights and how often films function as a form of literary interpretation and criticism, and how in particular recent film adaptations of Wuthering Heights have tied into what's going on in criticism. And at the end, I will have a question for you, and I will take all your questions from me. The first thing I want to do before I talk about the making of a classic is just think about a definition, which I'm sure you all know, but sometimes it's good to go to the dictionary. I love going to the dictionary. And it gives you a more multifaceted view of what a classic is or can be. So the first definition is of the first class, of the highest rank or importance. The second definition is slightly different. It's a standard or a model that you might try to follow. The third is tied to the whole idea of literature, and as with sacred texts, being of lasting interest and value. And the idea of canonical literature in the West is very much tied to theories of sacred texts in Western religions, that there is something special that makes you a better person, and that is not changing with changing social views, but is of enduring interest and value over time and across all peoples. The fourth definition is archetypal, and that means that it has certain types like myths and fairy tales, which again might be lasting and cross different cultures, types of people, types of stories. So that's another definition. And this all comes from the Oxford English Dictionary, and there are more details there if you're interested. So let's get cracking with Wuthering Heights. Right, this is the frontispiece of the first edition. Wuthering Heights, you'll see there, Emily Bronte used a pseudonym which had ambiguity as to gender, implying that it was a man who wrote it. There was a lot of prejudice against women writers. And, oh, I'm hearing some feedback. It's fine.
Sorry.
No, it's not a problem. As long as you can hear me, that's fine. Women were afraid, they felt that they wouldn't get as good a reception, as good a response if people knew they were women. They wanted to be judged for the writing. Hello? I'm hearing somebody talking. I think somebody hasn't muted the microphone. Can you just check? Great. So I'll keep going. So early reviews, let's listen. I love the way the Victorians wrote criticism. They use so much expression and so much over-the-top language. They're very entertaining to read. So here is one from the Atlas that was published. And the writer, who was anonymous, says, "It should have been called Withering Heights, for anything from which the mind and body could more instinctively shrink than the mansion and its inhabitants cannot be imagined." Then the Graham's Lady magazine in the same year. "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." Now, one of the things that you can see from that is that there are ideas about what literature should be and do in the 1840s in the mainstream middle class periodicals that people would read to get news and opinion and reviews and information about culture. And the idea is that it should be proper and it should be moral and it should be natural. One of the problems that happened with literature when it first started, particularly fiction, is people were very scornful of it. And they felt that this is, make-believe stories, it's a waste of your time. And so critics began to argue, no, by reading novels and reading about lives of people that you may not meet or you may not be yourself, you learn to be more sympathetic, more compassionate, and it will build a better society and it will make you a better person. So the idea, when you read characters that you can't identify with, that you can't feel sympathy or compassion for, that's a problem. But the second problem is the crime and evil that people saw in the book. The main function of literature at this time by mainstream critics is that it makes you moral and it improves you as a human being. So let's go on now and let's see a couple of reviews now that were a bit mixed about the book. Okay, so this is from the Examiner. This is a strange book. It is not without evidences of considerable power, but as a whole, it is wild and confused, disjointed and improbable. And the people who make up the drama, which is tragic enough in its consequences, are savages ruder than those who lived before the days of Homer. The idea, again, that literature should be a civilizing force for the working classes, for anyone really. But at the same time, you can see that this critic feels its power, finds it strange, but feels its power. And the things that this critic doesn't like is that it's not structured, it's wild, it's confused, we've got so many different narrators, it doesn't come together, and they don't believe that it's probable, it's realistic. Again, at this time, they love realistic literature, or what they thought was realistic. So now here's one more. Again, 1848. Another person found it a strange sort of book, baffling all regular criticism. I love that. This is a time at which a work of art is produced that doesn't fit into all the boxes of a contemporary criticism. It's actually baffling the critics. And yet this critic found it impossible to begin and not finish it, and impossible to lay it aside afterwards and not say anything about it. So this is what was left. In the midst of the reader's perplexity, and he's talking about himself, the ideas predominant in his mind concerning the book are likely to be brutal cruelty and semi-savage love. What may be the moral, which the author wishes the reader to deduce from his work, it's difficult to say, and we refrain from assigning any, because to speak honestly, we have discovered none, but mere glimpses of hidden morals or secondary meanings. There seems to us great power. See, we have the word strange, we have the word power again in this book, but a purposeless power which we feel a great desire to see turned to better account. We are quite confident that the writer of Wuthering Heights wants but the practiced skill to make a great artist, perhaps a great dramatic artist. So again, there's something not quite right with this. It needs to be more moral, and it needs to be more contemporary and more conventional, and then this is going to be great. One more before we move on to look at what they're complaining about in the novel. This is Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He's a poet and a pre-Raphaelite painter, fascinating character of the 19th century. He writes a letter to William Allingham. I've been greatly interested in Wuthering Heights, the first novel I've read for an age, and the best as regards power and sound style for 2 ages. Okay, so he's got power again, but he likes the style. But he says it is a fiend of a book, an incredible monster, combining all the stronger female tendencies. The action is laid in hell, only it seems places and people have English names there. Now, one thing, you may have studied Wuthering Heights and you may have looked at it as a Gothic novel. This is something I've done in my research, as the introduction attested. But the Gothic fiction of that day and earlier was generally set hundreds of years ago and in France or Spain. And what really bothered critics was that these were English people in the 19th century acting like Gothic villains. I don't really know what to say about the stronger female tendencies, this idea that the fiend and the monster and the female all go together, but I'll have to bracket that for now, something you could come back to and think about. So now what we're going to do is think about what are people complaining about with this book? And we're going to focus on the character of Heathcliff. Is Mr. Heathcliff a man? Is he the devil? Isabella, who marries Heathcliff, asks Nellie, the servant who was there when he arrived as a child and in the house where he grew up. Let's look and remind ourselves that some of the things Heathcliff did, because what tends to happen is this novel tends to be remembered as a great cosmic love story. But let's remember some of the other things and understand what these critics were complaining about. There are connotations of incest with Cathy. Okay, some people say, oh, you know, this is Mr. Earnshaw's illegitimate child and he's decided to take him in. That may or may not be true, but whether or not Cathy and Heathcliff are blood relations, the fact that they're raised from children together, that is considered to be strange and incestuous. So to be so passionately in love with effectively your sister. He is someone who helps Hindley, Cathy's brother, to self-destruct through drinking and gambling. Now, your average Victorian moral novel, you'd be trying to help people drinking and gambling, but he eggs him on and gets him to self-destruct so that he can take over his property. He also takes Hindley's child, whose mother has died, Hareton, and corrupts and degrades him. And he takes his special pleasure in the fact that Hareton is really a sensitive child. So this is child abuse. It is damaging and harming a child. He also abuses his wife, Isabella, and he's a sadist. He says, the more the worms writhe, the more I yearn to crush the entrails, that's their interiors. As he elopes with Isabella, the last thing he does is he hangs her lapdog. This is her special pet. Again, it's like a child. Now, the dog gets rescued, but that really isn't the point. Let's continue because we're not finished. So he has this tremendous love for Kathy, but he beats her. He seized her with the liberating hand and pulling her on his knee, he administered with the other a shower of terrific slaps on both sides of the head. And he's not apologetic for her. He thinks she deserves it. And again, if you're thinking of this as a great love story, I don't know how common in Iraq you get stories of domestic abuse, but we often read about these in the newspaper. There are documentaries where women and sometimes men are being beaten by their wives. And this is an air of concern. And when they come around saying, I love you, please forgive me, that is seen by psychologists as simply being a prelude to initiating another cycle of abuse. So to think, you know, if you feel that that kind of treatment of somebody you love is inappropriate, you know, this problematizes Heathcliff as the world's greatest lover. There are other disturbing things. He digs up Kathy's coffin. He wants to embrace her corpse. He's stopped by it. But this, you know, this is maybe a taste of necrophilia, or at least desecrating a grave. And then he takes the young Catherine, her daughter, who's just a young girl, away from her father and forces her to marry his son so that he can get both of the properties and get his revenge on Edgar for marrying Kathy and on Hindley for all his abuse as a child. So he's doing what Gothic villains do. He's doing economic forceful takeover. It's legal, but it's obviously been enabled by corrupting and forcing a marriage. So remember all of these things as we move on now to think about how views of the novel have changed. By the second edition, and we are talking just two and a bit years later, Sidney Dobell says that somehow his memory has taken the vivid and fearful pictures of the novel and cast a gauze veil over it. He says, one looks back at the whole story as to a world of brilliant figures in an atmosphere of mist, shapes that come out upon the eye and burn their colors into the brain and depart into an enveloping fog. So this kind of gauzy cover is actually covering over some of the brutality. And it is perhaps a reflection of how memory works, that you read something and it may be that certain things stay with you and other things fade away. So maybe this idea of this great love story is because you're so shocked when you see all these terrible things happening that you just kind of push them out and only remember the love. But by 1887, so that's 37 years later, there's a reviewer of a new edition of Wuthering Heights who says he fears he's resorting to truisms or plagiarisms. That means so conventional what everybody thinks and says, when he claims that Wuthering Heights is the most beautiful romance of the present century. We have to ask ourselves how that happened with all of these other things in there. I'm going to bracket that if you want to put something in the chat or come back to that in the question. We're now going to move on to what happened to Wuthering Heights. So, in the 1920s and 30s, Wuthering... Hello, somebody is...
Yes, Kamilla, you can mute her. You can mute her.
Okay.
Dr. Kamilla, you can mute her.
Okay. So, mute.
Yeah.
Okay. The novel became a cult classic in the 20s because after World War I in the West, people lost faith in the ability of art to make the world more beautiful. Here you have Queen Victoria's children and grandchildren slaughtering each other and whole generations of men, for about 8 miles of land. So there was also a move away from realism. So you saw in 1848 that people were saying it needs to be more realistic, but people don't want realism. They want surrealism, they want cubism, they want different kinds of art. So Wuthering Heights started to be seen through this veil of something that isn't realistic and something that has already shown the depravity of the Victorians who...
Dr. Kamilla, please.
Yeah.
You can mute her.
Can I mute?
Yeah.
Let me figure out how to do this.
We are really sorry. Dr. Mace, please mute your mic.
How can I mute? Okay, I found them now. I'll mute her.
Yeah.
What's the name? Q.
Mace.
So I'm looking down the list for Mace. Next time what I'll do is I'll so that
mute all, please. Mute
Dr.
all.
Mace, Dr. Mace, her name.
Mute.
Mute all, Dr. Kamilla, please.
Okay, let me just, how do I mute all? Oh, got it. Thank you. I'm learning how to use Zoom from you. Okay, now I've learned. This is something that I've never done before, and I thank you very much. We've now got it muted. I hope you could hear some of that. Just to go over in case you missed it, the flight from realism and morality after World War I, the idea that art isn't a place where we are making moral progress, and that World War I had revealed the depravity of human beings, and Wuthering Heights actually tapped into people who wanted to explore that depravity. And then you have surrealists like Louis Buñuel, who admired the novel for its strange blend of love and hatred. Then you have in the 20s and 30s, people rescuing Wuthering Heights by saying it has a Shakespearean quality to it, these two generations, one tragic, one happy ending, or by saying that it's a philosophical cosmic drama and it transcends normal social, moral standards. Other people felt, oh, this is the best creation of a villain since Shakespeare's Iago. And the last slide on the criticism for now, before we get to film, talks about, this is 1949. Melvin R. Watson affirms that it's now generally acknowledged to be one of the greatest English novels, but it has gained this recognition only after a battle with critics and the public, which has lasted a large part for the 100 years since its publication. But I want to suggest now that something else happened before 1949 to help make Wuthering Heights a classic, and also to make it be seen as a great love story. And that is the film adaptation of Wuthering Heights by MGM. So you see here a film poster. I am Heathcliff, I married a woman I loathe to spite the one woman I love. And one of the most important things about film adaptation that you might take away with you today is that film adaptations increase the sales of books exponentially. So Wuthering Heights sold more copies between 1939 and 1940 than it had sold in the almost 100 years since its publication. And this is something that is predicted by the Ladies' Home Journal. More people probably will read Wuthering Heights this year than in any year since it was published, for millions will see on the screen the most enthralling love story in the English language. So now I want to look at how this film romanticized Heathcliff, villainized Cathy, and also gave us Nellie's Heathcliff and Nellie's version of Cathy. So a common criticism of this film is that it softens and romanticizes the novel's Heathcliff. In this film, his financial revenge on Hindley is simply limited to paying off his gambling debts and then legitimately reimbursing himself with Wuthering Heights, the property. He does not hang Isabella's dog. He does not beat Cathy. There is no second generation for him to exploit or abuse. But one thing I want to share with you is that this isn't just a change from the book. There are romanticizations of Heathcliff in the book itself. So if you look at different characters in the book and how they see Heathcliff, then you will see some of the basis for the Heathcliff in the story. So, for example, Isabella, who marries Heathcliff, makes him into a romantic ideal. She overlooks his savagery and greed, and she says he has an honorable soul, or how could he remember Cathy? And she pictures in him a hero of romance, although Heathcliff knows that and scorns her for it in the book. But we've seen also that readers romanticize Heathcliff and cling to Isabella's view of him. So what's happening is this film is adopting a part of the book, Isabella's view, but not the whole view of the book. And the other character who is feeding Heathcliff to us in this way is Nellie Dean. She tries to get him, wish and learn to soothe away the surly wrinkles, change your eyes from fiends to angels, don't suspect things, doubt nothing, see friends, and so on. She gives him advice about how to improve himself. And it's almost as if in this film he's taken on that advice. This is exactly how Laurence Olivier performs the role. And he presents himself as if Nellie herself had groomed him. And so we have the idea that Heathcliff is softened, but we also have going with that, Cathy becomes more villainized. In this film, she dies from sheer frustration that she can't have both men. She's selfish, she's peevish, she's spiteful, she hurts everyone. And in the book, this is also Nellie's view of Cathy when she enters her final illness, is she's just having a tantrum, she's just doing it to be selfish and to put other people out. It turns out she is ill, she does die. But we have this adaptation of character views of Heathcliff here. So I'm going to look at one more. Well, it depends how much time we have. I was told to speak for about half an hour. So I'll do this one and then I'll see if we're out of time here. So this is a London Weekend Television adaptation of Wuthering Heights. And it restores Heathcliff's brutality, but it does so in order to be in line with feminist criticism. This Heathcliff beats and kicks people who dare to share the screen with him. When he takes possession of Edgar's house, Thrushcross Grange, he smashes all the ornaments and furnishings, which is a really distressing scene for a lot of viewers who watch these adaptations because they love all the museum-like Victorian interiors and ephemera. And he's very brutal with Isabella and with Cathy. Now, one of the points that I want to make about this film is how much it works like literary criticism. So when you write an essay criticizing a literary text, you will select passages and you'll put them together and you'll create a narrative around them. So, you know, if you're doing a thing about narration, you will find all the narrators, you'll make an essay about who's narrating and what it all means. what happens is this film does the same kind of thing. So just like, say, a feminist critic would take all the scenes about women and look at the lives of women in this book and how they suffer, or where they have power, where they don't have power, their relations with men, with other women, with money, whatever. So too, this film does that. So what it does is it takes pieces of the novel, and there's one scene that creates a late 20th century feminist critical narrative, wordlessly, through editing of film, of sound, and settings. What you see is shots of a delirious Kathy who is ill, screaming on a bed while the doctor holds, her husband holds her down, and the doctor forcibly cuts her hair. And this is was seen as a way to make people, I'm just going to go into another view here, hold on, because we have people joining me. Let's just see if I can get up to the screen. Yep, I think I can do it. Mute all. Mute all. There we go.
Yeah, please.
Done. Okay. All right. I'm learning. Let me just get this closed, this window closed here. Okay, so we have that scene. Kathy, she's screaming, she's having a haircut. It's supposed to help her, the fever or whatever, when you cut hair like that. But it is intercut with scenes of Isabella on her wedding night with Heathcliff. Now, there's nothing explicitly shown, but he's being very rough with her. And she is in shock, and she is lying there without saying a word or making a sound, absolutely traumatized by how brutal he is. But the intercutting means that Kathy's screams are carrying across into the room where Isabella is silently being beaten by Heathcliff. And so what that intercutting does is it makes what's happening to both women, they're both being pressed down onto beds by men and having violent acts, whether it's cutting the hair or whatever, and the noise going back and forth and the music carrying creates a connection between the women that's very much like a feminist essay, literary essay would be criticizing Wuthering Heights. They would talk about Kathy and they would talk about Heathcliff. And what that does is that punctures this whole romantic ideal of Wuthering Heights, because in this case, in both cases, romantic fantasies shatter in the very location where Isabella and television audiences were hoping to have them fulfilled, which is the marital bedroom. And now I've talked for half an hour, which is what you asked. There are some more films, and I could share the slides with you later. But if you would like, shall I now, can I unmute? Who do I need to unmute? Let's see. Let me see if I can. Let's see. Majeed?
Yeah.
This is 30 minutes. I haven't unmute. You're not muted. Is it a good place to stop?
I can't hear you.
Oh, hang on. You can't hear me. Let me just go here. Just see.
Yes.
Mute your mic, please, Mr. Majeed. Just mute your mic. That's all.
Okay. So now I have talked for 30 minutes. I can talk more if you would like more, or we can stop now and have discussion. What would you like?
Yeah, it is time for discussion, I think. Thank you very much for engaging lecture about the novel. I start with my questions, Dr. Kamilla.
Yes, I'm just going to see if I can get the chat open.
Yeah.
So I have stopped sharing and okay. All right.
Yes.
If I can get the chat open, but go ahead and ask me your question and I'll see if I
can. Dr. Kamilla, we know that the play at that time is published under pseudonym.
Yes.
not by the actual name of Emily Bronte.
Yes.
Do you think that because of the society at that time, because such subjects are not allowed or a kind of taboo?
Yes, well, I don't know if it was the subject. It was something that was quite common in the early 19th century. Sir Walter Scott, for example, with his highly celebrated novels, started out publishing anonymously, and he did that because he was a lord and it was a bit lowly for him to be writing. But I think that the reason that these sisters, all three of them, published their novels under a pseudonym was because they wanted their work to be judged on what it was, and they knew if they put a female name on it, they would have a different level of criticism. Also, they were the daughters of a clergyman, and it was not always respectable to write novels until you get the until you become famous, and then a lot of people would cast off their pseudonyms, and they would tell everyone, yes, that's me. Jane Austen, for example,
Yeah.
even though they didn't have her name on, people knew who she was by the end of her life.
Yeah. The second question, when we read the play, we see the play is shrouded with Gothic and mysterious atmosphere. To be honest, I visited when I was in the UK, I visited Bronte's house.
Oh, yes. Lovely. Okay, we've frozen up here, I think. I think it's just frozen now.
I see the graveyard is very close to their house.
Yes.
Does it contribute or fear? Yes. Do you hear?
Yeah. The record is freezing a little bit, but I think you asked about the graveyard close to the house.
Yeah.
And people do think that that may have contributed to poor health, but tuberculosis, which was the cause of death of the younger sisters, the two other sisters died away at boarding school. Tuberculosis is very, very common among young people, people in their 20s and 30s. But I think that people generally think that it was kind of damp and unhealthy, and it was fairly contagious. And Charlotte Bronte died, didn't die of tuberculosis, she died of dehydration associated with pregnancy and excessive morning sickness. But yeah, it's hard to say. People have said that about the graveyard.
Yeah, great. Now the questions for participants, and I ask Dr. Ahmed to ask Dr. Kamilla if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Dr. Ahmed.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Majeed, and thank you for our dear Professor Kamilla, hoping that we can have a type of mutual knowledge as far as the novel is concerned. Thank you very much. First of all, going back to the classic features that you have mentioned, Professor,
Yes.
actually you have come so close to certain points as I can remember and recall, such type of highest rank of importance, and it has certain value and archetypal, going back to certain myth or type of culture and people.
Yes.
But actually, you didn't catch where can people find such type of features. I mean, classic features that you have raised as a criteria to judge that such type of novel can be judged as a classic or not. So can you please?
Yeah, well, there are different views about the classic. I mean, in some cases, it's just this is something that we think is important and of great value. In other cases, as you say, there are archetypes, such as there are stories that have been found all over the world in different cultures that had no contact for thousands of years. So, for example, the story where an outsider comes into a community and somehow saves it, usually by death or sacrifice. sometimes is seen as being born of a virgin, and then disappears or dies. That story over and over and over again is told across many cultures, and it appears in religions and so on. I think what I had at the end of my slides was I probably am a little bit more skeptical, I would say, about classics, because there were books that were considered to be a classic in their own day that have disappeared. There are classics that have stayed, like Jane Austen, from the time she published till now, she's been highly respected. Wuthering Heights, I think it has more to do with what people value, what academics value at any one time, what a culture or society values. But one of the good definitions I heard when I was a postgraduate student from Marjorie Garber at Harvard University, she said a classic or a really worthy literary text is one that will sustain many different interpretations, many different approaches. And I think in some ways that's what we do for a living. And we don't want books that just have one simple explanation, because then we'd be out of a job. So I don't want to be cynical, but I think in terms of the value of study, you can, the films I didn't show, there's a film that looks at it in terms of empire and race and colonization. And recently now people are starting to look at it in terms of ecology, and there are different, because everyone's concerned about climate change now. So there are ways in which that novel has something to feed all of these different kinds of interests, questions, and issues. And I think probably that, at least in academia, is the main thing that makes a text endure, because it can be interpreted. But I think also in terms of film adaptation, I've been teaching Shakespeare adapted recently. Shakespeare is adapted over and over and over again. I just did a Bollywood adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, and it is speaking to Hindu culture, to Bollywood culture, and they co-opt it and they adapt it and they use it to explore their concerns and the issues and the conventions of their cinema. So I hope, does that answer?
Yeah, definitely. So in other sense, such type of classics can have such themes, and can be valid for any generation, since it deals with human issues, not limited with certain, let us say, nation or person or culture. So a work that can urge many topics and concepts and interpretation can be laid down as a classic.
Yes. And something you just made me think for the first time is there's something about this being so primitive, so savage, out on the moors, that almost gives it the status of some kind of ancient myth, even though, it is in 19th century Yorkshire. And I think that has another thing that's fed into that. But as you say, it's because of the human dynamics and relationships. And, the fact that I could say Heathcliff's relationship to Cathy resembles abusive domestic relationships that I have read about.
Very, very passionate and heartfelt novel, like it.
Yeah.
And story between Cathy and Heathcliff. By the way, ma'am, I can just now recall certain lines. Actually, I have myself studied the text when I was in third year in 1990. And it just comes to my mind, saying that I think Cathy says that she said that Heathcliff is here in my mind, in my soul, in my spirit. Just justifying for her brother how far the love relationship is there between two humans. And even though it was prevented by her brother, but she bears in her mind, in her soul, such type of value of love. That's why I'm always looking for human issues to be digged up down from text, just to be highlighted in front of people to be dealt with.
Yes, And I think you're right there, the soul, it sort of transcends the social, cultural, historical specifics of their relationship. And it is describing a kind of soulmate, a spiritual, or you could say psychological, I don't know what your view would be, but that gives it that kind of primal rawness, and it isn't cluttered with going to a ball and asking someone to dance and then going to visit them for tea and all of those cultural things that characterize so many 19th century courtship novels.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Professor Kamilla, and I hope that we can get the input in between, leaving my colleagues in case they have certain questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are fabulous questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Dr. Majeed. All the best.
Yes, I missed the question on chat.
Okay.
So you can.
Shall I go to
ask Dr.
Yeah, I'll go to the chat here. Okay, these are really good questions. So thank you for your kind words. MA literature students, welcome, making me feel welcome. I really appreciate that. Okay, very good question from Susan Jaff. Why does she have so many people telling the story? This is one of the things the critics criticized her for. It was disjointed. But I think that what she is definitely trying to get across is, well, there's two reasons. One is there's so many different perspectives and views. She doesn't want to be this omniscient, godlike narrator telling you exactly how it is. And she doesn't just want one person telling point of view. But I think another major reason is because Heathcliff is so awful and so appalling that she wants primarily to filter him through this uneducated, good-hearted housekeeper, Nellie. And she wants Nellie to be expressing the shock and the horror that middle-class readers, and yet also Nellie is sympathetic to Heathcliff and she tries to help him. So Nellie is trying to get readers to be more sympathetic at the same time she's expressing some of their reservations. And I think the reason you have Lockwood outside as the outward frame is because they need a middle-class gentleman to somehow legitimate this story. But also it creates distance and uncertainty. And then, as you say, you've got letters or people telling stories, and it gives you a very powerful moment, you know, when you suddenly see what Isabella is thinking or feeling, because she's been so silenced. That's a really good question. So now we have the title. Wuthering Heights is sort of blown by the wind heights. It's the name of the house where the Cathy and Heathcliff and Hindley grow up, the Earnshaw household. And I think you can make more significance of it. It certainly helped the professor I told you about, David Cecil, who wanted to make it a cosmic drama, kind of a primal, you know, beyond time and space drama. The blown around heights, it gives it a kind of mythical significance. There may be other answers, and if anybody wants to say anything, please type them in the chat, because we could think about that. So now somebody has asked me, it's a private question, so I won't say who it is, and I'm so sorry, I can't read Arabic either. Is Heathcliff the antagonist or the protagonist? It's a very good question. Right now, in a lot of films in the West, the anti-hero is very popular. The kind of hero who's a little bit of a bad guy, but ultimately does something good or is just mixed. And I think we do have, and the next question, the tortured romantic hero archetype, absolutely. Emily Bronte loved Lord Byron, and he had this tortured self, particularly in his poem Manfred. And unlike the Gothic villains who are often just purely evil and not at all tortured, she does this strange blend of this person who is doing bad things, but is suffering. And she gets that definitely from Lord Byron. And that is a very compelling type. I mean, I think it is an archetype. That's a very good question. And yes, Tabark, I don't know if I can pronounce this right, Gurgi Ali. I think Heathcliff is a victim, not a devil. And yes, if I had more time, and you can maybe look at this if it's available for you, there's a film in 2011 by Andrea Arnold, and it's very much emphasizing Heathcliff as a victim. And she does this by making him a runaway slave that Earnshaw found in the Liverpool docks and brought home. And he's Black, and he's treated terribly, and he's abused. And this is kind of his reaction and his defense. And in the book itself, I mean, Hindley is horrible to him. And when Earnshaw dies, he loses his protector. So yes, I think this is a question that often comes up in newspaper articles and court cases, is that people do horrific things and commit terrible crimes. And almost always they have had unspeakable abuse as children, unspeakable suffering. And it is always a dilemma of how you feel about them and what you do in response to them. You know, in some ways society has an obligation to keep them from hurting other people. And, you know, there's a whole bunch of questions here. But yes, I do think Nellie is sympathetic to Heathcliff. I think in the beginning, especially, we really feel for his suffering. And then at the end, he's just so tortured by his grief for Cathy, and he's not eating and he's not sleeping and he's gone insane. And again, you know, that can be a sympathetic, I mean, we might look at that as mental illness. We might look at it as just tragic love. So I'm sorry about that barking, there are dogs outside. Yes, the victim of abuse. Yes. And, you know, I think Maysam Baha, I think you often find people go in one of two directions. They either become abusive because they've been abused, or they become caretakers and rescuers. You know, there's often the people who've been abused that they try and help and rescue other people. And yes, this is a very clear, you're making very clear points about this abuse and about the effects of abuse, and that we can't just look at Heathcliff as the bad guy. We've got to look at Hindley, we've got to look at the society, and somebody put class as the main conflict, the major problem, Galaxy A21s. Yes, the class system in Britain is to blame, and there's some very good criticism about that. And Cathy is a victim of class. It's why she can't marry Heathcliff, because she doesn't want to descend in class. And she thinks, maybe if I marry Edgar, then I can help him, but I can't. If I marry him, we're just both going to so the class system's a huge villain. So we had the title question. Definitely he's not a devil. I love how compassionate you all are. It's wonderful. As turned him into a punisher and have him behave devilishly. Yeah, this is, I mean, one of the things that's really good about Emily Bronte is she sees the psychology of abusive. I don't know how much you know about the Bronte's family life, but they had a brother. His name was Branwell Bronte, and he was a raging alcoholic. And and some people say he's the basis of bits of Mr. Rochester, definitely the basis of Heathcliff. And also there's a sister named Anne Bronte who wrote a novel called The Tenant of Wildfell Hall about an alcoholic abusive husband. But there is the sense of sympathy. They weren't born bad, they were made bad. And I love all these kind and sympathetic comments, and I share with them. I think when I started out, I was trying to explain why people didn't like this novel, and also the strangeness of it having been turned into the greatest romance of all time, or of the 19th century, or of our recent history, instead of being a novel about abuse and what happens to people who are abused. And his addiction is not to alcohol or to gambling, it's to Cathy. It's like and it is the kind of addictive relationship that many abusers have with women. They're not strong, powerful people. They are so dependent on the woman's love and the woman's unquestioning submission to them that they feel their very identity and their lives are threatened. And that leads them to be abusive. But obviously we have to think about the people being abused as well. Dr. Maysoon Tahir Muhi, Bronte is such a great writer. She's able to name, yes. I think that is such an important point, really, really important. You can see everything they're doing and you can be horrified by it. And you can see how self-destructive Kathy is, and yet you feel for them. That is an excellent point. So now, distinguish it, complexity and the mystery. And then we have the 16th and 18th century. The oppression of women is the same. Yeah. That's a long question to answer, but I can give a couple of points here. I mean, I think it's the same all over the world in many places. I am in an unusual situation in, being able to get a degree and be a job and speak to you. But I grew up in a very, very fundamentalist Christian family where women, the role was very, very prescribed, and education was not something to be done beyond school. It was supposed to make you a better wife and a better mother. And so I think there are still a lot of issues, and many of them are economic, many of them are just the way education is, and some of them, I'm sure, are partly biological. But yes, it's, I think you're right, the oppression of women. And yet, one thing I would say about Wuthering Heights, Kathy's a really strong, feisty character, and she doesn't give in much. She makes a mistake, I think, in marrying Edgar, but yeah. Okay, so we have so many. The feminist criticism. Hindley's brother is also a victim. Yeah, I think the problem is when you talk about abuse and victims, you're never just one or the other, you're often both. So the abuser is a victim, and then the victim is abused. I can't say that Isabella is abusive. She doesn't have the power to be abusive. But yes, Hindley's brother is a victim. Yeah, and his father. I mean, this is like the story of Joseph in the Hebrew Bible. I'm sure you have stories where there's a favorite child and the brothers, try and kill him or send him off in slavery. Yes, these are really good points. It shows real understanding. Can we consider the dilemma of the orphan Heathcliff and his bad behavior at the end as a consequence or result towards his not only his beloved in society? Yeah, I mean, I think it's a mixture of personal, social, family that creates us, all of us. So when you grow up on the Yorkshire Moors, you have a very small community. Let's say Heathcliff was in London. Well, he might be able to meet more people and have more opportunities and find more outlet, but he isn't. He's in this village where he is considered a gypsy, a brat, a gutter snipe, and yet he's in a middle-class family and being tantalized all the time with the fact he doesn't belong. You're not one of us. And that must be so frustrating and so upsetting. And now I'm so sorry I can't read Arabic, but there's some comments in the bottom. They might just be people needing to leave because we're almost out of time.
Leave Arabic, Dr. Kamilla.
Sorry?
Leave Arabic, only the English one.
Okay, so I think I've finished. The orphan, let me just make sure I haven't left anyone out. Catherine's brother Hindley. Oh, the main conflicts in Wuthering Heights and they relate to the novel's theme. That's a very large and important question. I would say probably class conflict is the greatest, and I think that is the greatest determinant of the prejudice, but also family rivalry, family jealousy. I would say the problems of the soul and the body, and that is articulated in issues of what happens after death. Heathcliff is seen by a shepherd boy after he's died walking on the moor with a woman, so the idea of some kind of soul versus body connection. What else? I'm trying to think. That's a really good question. Anybody can type in if they have any thoughts here. But you see, critics, as my lecture underscored, critics will create stories. There are stories about, like there was somebody who's researched people that the Brontes knew who had slave shares. So they've done a whole reading of Wuthering Heights in terms of slavery, quoting Nellie saying, who is to say your mother was an African queen or your father was a Chinese emperor? You know, you might have come from some exotic foreign place. And there are people who are looking at the windmill farms of the day in that period and writing about climate. So the themes, you can make Wuthering Heights probably conform to many themes that might interest you. People have written about religion, they've written about mythology, they've written about psychology, many, many things. Got one new message. Hold on.
Yeah,
Okay, oh no, that's just refreshed. Okay. Yeah, that's a great imagine. I love it. Is this YM Albayat? I love when people imagine how the story might be different. Or what, and this is actually a really good way to then go back and look at how the story is. And this is what I like about film adaptation, because you do get people making the story different. And then I go back to the novel and I see things I didn't see before I saw the film. And then the novel and the film together often help me to understand both better.
I think the last question from Marwa Ghazi, Dr. Marwa.
Yes.
In the chat you can.
Very good. So why does she end in the tragic way? Well, in a way, it doesn't end there. I mean, Heathcliff does die at the end, but we have that second generation. Shakespeare has three or four kinds of genres. We have history, comedy, tragedy, and romance. And in the romance, the first half is a tragedy. It's the first generation, awful. Then we have the second generation, their children, and they restore the older generation. And they go back and they heal what went wrong with the first generation. And that is there in this book. Even though Heathcliff is such a powerful character, he overshadows everything, we have the young Catherine and Hareton marrying. And Hareton has Cathy's eyes, you know, so there's some of Cathy there too. And there is this sense that there is healing for the second generation, but that the first generation is tragic. And I think him dying sort of at the end, which allows their marriage to happen. So his death, just like Romeo and Juliet, their death healed the family feud. His death allows now for the second generation to be happy and to start again. Okay, so I was asked if he was the protagonist or the antagonist, but I think that is old chat, isn't it? And maybe I didn't answer it. And that's okay. Oh, I think I did answer this indirectly by talking about anti-heroes who are actually the heroes of a lot of films today. So they are bad people who are heroes. But I would actually say this is, I mean, he's probably the protagonist, but he also is self-destructive. So he is his own antagonist, but there are many antagonists to him. There isn't one, there's society. And I think that's what makes this a kind of special story, this individual protagonist trying to survive and thrive and get what he wants in society. And he actually doesn't really in the end. He does all kinds of evil. And I think there is a moral that he's not happy having got all this property. He doesn't find another woman and get married and have children. Okay, so now we have one last, should we make this the last one? Is it 1 o'clock that we end? Is that right?
Yeah.
It's almost 1 o'clock. Shall I do the last one from Hannah?
Dr. Kamilla. Yeah, okay. From Hannah.
Yeah, Hannah. Yeah, what is it relevant? In the age of globalization, interracial.
Hannah, yes.
That's a really good question. I think what I'd like to see about is somebody adapting. I mean, I saw a wonderful adaptation of Romeo and Juliet to a Bollywood film made in 2012 by Sanjay Leela Bhansali, which adapted it to some of the scenes there were the most powerful scenes I've ever seen, and more powerful than in Shakespeare's play. Others were, but I think, and they're very much about globalization and interracial marriages and transnational marriages. I'd love to see an adaptation of this where maybe, and this is Dr. Mara Ghazi Mohammed, if it ended differently, maybe writing a novel or making a film which re-envisions this for today. And there's actually a load of novels, neo-Victorian novels you could look up, which rewrite loads of like Great Expectations. There's a book called Mags. It's a Magwitch's point of view, and it's written by an Australian, and Magwitch goes off to, you know, the colonies. And then there is a book about Jane Eyre from the point of view of the mad woman in the attic. And there are all these different, you know, sequels or endings or re-envisioning of things. There's a book called Pemberley about Darcy and Lizzie after they get married, and a murder mystery. So there are wonderful ways to explore text through creative writing and creative imagination. And that is one of the relevances, I would say to Hannah, of literature for today. It helps us to be imaginative and creative and to envision. You know, somebody was saying to me, what is literature going to do to change the problems in the world? Well, we work with imagination, and we can maybe imagine and envision things that aren't yet. Creative writers. I have a colleague who works on climate change, and he says, nothing we're doing is working. You know, maybe your creative writers can think about things that actually, you know, will get through. It's not that they don't have technologies that will work, it's persuading people to use them. And maybe writers and literature can find ways to encourage people to be more compassionate, as that wonderful opening, Professor, that you gave, and more understanding and more open to differences. Okay, well, I think we're probably out of time.
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kamilla, for this engaging, stimulating lecture. It's really an interesting lecture. I think all of the participants get benefit from the information given by you. Your cooperation is highly appreciated by my university, and we look forward to more cooperation between us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and wonderful questions from everyone. I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Shall I stop the recording now?